This week on the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, Josh and I will be doing Michael Smiley impressions.
Michael Smiley being, of course, an Irish actor with a Northern Irish accent.
Now, you might remember him from his role in Spaced, playing a bike courier on drugs.
Or his role in Kill List, where he plays a hired killer.
Or from various other roles. The man is a versatile actor and a perfect role model for the Belfast accent.
Right, time to warm up.
Don't you tell me to warm up. Don't you fucking tell me to warm up. I'll warm you up, I will. There's nothing warm about me. Your man needs warming. Is that what you want from me?
Okay, I think you're ready to record.
Don't you tell me when I'm ready or not ready to record. I've been recording all my fucking life. I was born recording.
And while Liam slips deeper into an accent they cannot escape from, the credits.
I'll give you the credit, you fucking...
The Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, brought to you today by Josh Edison and M. Dentith. Hello and welcome to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy in Auckland, New Zealand. I am Josh Edison, and in Guangzhou, China, for now, it's Dr. M. R.X. Dentith.
Oh, Josh, you're giving spoilers away. So,
Well,
actually, we have mentioned on the podcast.
I think you have
going
mentioned,
to
yes,
Otago
yeah.
for a month. So,
Yeah.
yes, but actually, it is basically the next time we record will be after I'm back in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But effectively,
after-
being an island away, the same kind of distance. Sorry, after...
After another event that I believe is coming up next week.
Oh, you mean the agening?
The agening, yes, you've timed it so you'll actually be in the country around your birthday, which means I will have to get you a birthday present. This was your plan all along, wasn't it, you crafty individual?
It's true. I actually started the PhD with this in mind all those many years ago, on the notion that with hard work and graft, I'd eventually go to Romania and then all the way back to the Waikato and then all the way to China in order that for the advent of my 48th birthday, I would be in my home country a few days after my birthday and thus seeing you a month after that, thus forcing you to give me a gift of some kind. It has been a cunning plan and it has taken years and years of work for basically no benefit.
The culmination of all your efforts.
It's true.
Yeah. So anyway, that's what you're going to be doing. When exactly do you...
So this is one of these things, I'm catching a midnight flight. So I go to the airport on a Friday evening, but I leave the country in a Saturday morning. And then I arrive back home on a Saturday evening and then fly to Dunedin on a Sunday morning. Travelling internationally is confusing. Time zones make it even more so.
Yes, and New Zealand is far from everywhere. So... That's your personal circumstances out of the way. I have no personal circumstances. My life is dull and grey at all times. So we should
just like Auckland's weather.
Well, at this time of year, yes. Anyway, we have an episode. It's about a topic that has nothing to do with books, probably.
No, although it does. It's, I mean, as we're going to get into after we play the Sting. It's the kind of thing which we probably could spend several episodes discussing, but that would be kind of pointless.
But we won't.
Because we're talking about a podcast, and you can just go and listen to that podcast.
Exactly. Yes.
So without any further ado, let's stop tramping about the bush, prevaricating like a prehistoric monster, some other analogy about wasting time, and let's get to it.
Yes. Yes, because this is, it's not a book review, but I guess it is a podcast review. We are today going to be talking about Series 3 of Bed of Lies by Kara
Now,
Goodman.
Caddy listeners will realise we talked about Series 1 of Bed of Lies back in March of 2021, and that was a Telegraph podcast. Yes, Telegraph podcast. A podcast from the Telegraph in the UK. This podcast, as they will hereafter be known which means you have now to change the name of our recording
we're the
to the Podcrasters Guide to the Conspiracy.
I'll get on to it. Talk to the graphic artist. Yep.
God, this is going to be massive. And we have to tell every other podcaster out there that actually they're podcasts now. Actually, I think maybe, and I realize this is a stunning reversal. I think we should go back to the old way of pronouncing the word and call them podcasts.
I've almost forgotten how, but yes, okay.
Yeah, so, I mean, it'll take us a while, but we'll get used to it. It's a Telegraph podcast. The first series was looking at basically the police infiltrating left-wing activist groups in the UK and getting up to all sorts of no good, including going into long-term relationships with activists in order to use them as sources, and in some cases almost getting married to some of those activists, which was a really interesting gambit because the men who were almost getting married to the activists were already married themselves.
Yes, it was a very dodgy affair. So you can. This podcast is available presumably wherever you get podcasts, so you can go back and listen to it yourself. Or if you want to hear our summary, as Em says, you could go look at our episode 305 from March 2021. Now, we never did series 2. I started listening to it, and it seemed a little more dry. I guess, I don't know, and yet at the same time more depressing.
Yeah. So the second series was looking at a blood contamination scandal that was occurring both in the US and the UK. So effectively, haemophiliacs were getting blood products that were infected with a variety of diseases, including HIV. And essentially there was a cover-up going on, not just in the United States, where the blood products were coming from, because the UK was importing cheap blood products from the United States that mostly came from the US prison system. But also the British government was covering up the fact that they knew these blood products were infected with things like HIV, and yet continued to supply people with them, not just for weeks or months, but in some cases, years approaching a decade or so. And so it's a rather depressing story because a lot of people died of AIDS as a consequence of the blood product scandal. And it is something which is still being litigated through the courts in the UK to this day, where the basic argument is, how much does the government actually know? They admit they knew some of it, but they're not willing to admit they knew as much as it appears from the records they should have known.
Yes, but Series 3, the series that we're going to talk about today, actually does have a fairly high body count as well, really. But it is about the use by the police and the army and MI5 of agents inside paramilitary organisations in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. So this series, did we say this? The Bed of Lies series is a series by investigative reporter Cara McGugan. She's done all 3 series,
yes,
so it's her looking into this. Yeah, so 9 episodes long, which comes to must be at least 10 hours worth of podcast. So we're going to sum up the main points. There's a lot we're not going to talk about because
Now,
details,
I would like to point out, I told Josh that we should cover this podcast after I had listened to all 9 episodes. And so Josh has been listening to Bed of Lies Series 3 over the last month or so and compiled a quite astounding and very detailed list of events that occur in each individual episode. And over the course of the last week has managed to condense this down into a storyline that we can discuss on this podcast in probably less than an hour.
I hope.
The 10 hours of the podcast goes into incredible detail as to what shenanigans, and shenanigans really seems like a very quaint and not disturbing way to describe what was going on during the Troubles. What was going on? It does sound
kind of Irish.
It does a wee bit, but at the same time, kind of Irish mocking in a way.
Yeah.
But anyway, what we're going to be discussing here really is quite conspiratorial, and it's a conspiracy being led by, if not governments, arms of the British government.
Yes. So we're talking about the Troubles. The Troubles the euphemistic title for the period of, what would you call it? It's not civil war. It's very much not civil war because the various parties were not armies; they were paramilitary organizations. Civil unrest, civil conflict.
Well, I mean, that's kind of why they called it the Troubles. It
Yeah,
was a
because
way
there
of
wasn't a
talking about
good
how,
name for it.
because effectively, at one stage, Ireland belonged to the Irish, and then the British decided they were going to take Ireland over because they wanted it for themselves. And eventually, the Irish got most of it back, apart from a little segment in the north, which is quaintly called Northern Ireland. And certain Irish people went, actually, we kind of want all of Ireland to be united. And certain other Irish people going, no, we don't. We want to maintain our ties to the United Kingdom. And these two sides operating within Northern Ireland caused an awful lot of bother for the British government, to the point where they found it to be a troubling situation, and they called it the Troubles.
Yeah, so it went from the late 1960s and officially ended in 1998 following the Good Friday Agreement. It was a period of rather a lot of violence, mostly in Northern Ireland, but obviously there were famously IRA's bombing campaigns in Britain, which is the reason why, as far as I'm aware, there are still no public trash receptacles in London. Is that still the case?
Oh, that is a good. I'm now going. Have I seen one in
I've
London?
not been to London since 2006.
It isn't the kind of thing I go around looking for, truth be told. Although I'm always annoyed by the lack of public trash receptacles in Guangzhou, but that's because it has a very different attitude towards rubbish than we're used to back home. The other thing to note is the whole North Head Tunnels conspiracy theory thing is very much indebted to the Troubles, because John Earnshaw was living in London, and after a car bomb went off in his street, decided to emigrate to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and became interested in the North Head story, because as a documentarian, he was looking for a story to make in his new home. So the Troubles are also the reason why we have books like Tunnel Vision.
Well, how about that?
Twist.
So, I mean, it's an incredibly complex situation, but I guess the salient points that you need to know, if you don't already, that on the two sides were basically the Catholic anti-British Republicans who wanted Northern Ireland to become part of the Republic of Ireland versus the Protestant pro-British loyalists who wanted Northern Ireland to stay part of Great Britain. And it's, yeah, but I mean, there's more to it than that, isn't there?
Well, yeah. So the reason why you have a kind of sectarian divide in Northern Ireland is that when the English decided to take over Ireland, they created what is called the Ulster Plantation. Plantation is just another name for colony in Northern Ireland, because that was taken to be the less populated and less occupied by the Irish part of the northern part of Ireland. And so the English imported a lot of Presbyterian Scots to live on the Ulster Plantation. So when you have this kind of Catholic versus Protestant conflict, what you have are Irish Catholics and Scottish Irish Presbyterians who are basically having a conflict over colonization. And it just happens to be that the two sides in this particular debate, the Irish and now the Scots Irish, are conflicted along religious lines. But it's not the religion which is driving the conflict. It's the colonization which is driving the conflict in the first place.
Yeah. So during the Troubles, these illegal paramilitary, I think we can call them terrorist organisations, formed on both sides. Most famously, the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, on the Catholic Republican side. And on the Protestant/Loyalist side, you had organisations like the Ulster Defence Association, the UDA, and the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF. And one of the things that makes the podcast a little confusing is you have all these three-letter acronyms, including the official forces there at the time. So they all, as well as the UDA, which is the illegal paramilitary organisation, you have the UDR, the Ulster Defence Regiment, which is the name for the army regiment that's actually there in Northern Ireland, and also the RUC, which is the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which are the local police.
And the RUC are often just referred to as the Ruck.
Yeah. So the series, kind of at the core of the series, which are introduced in the first episode, are 3 murders of innocent civilians, which were 3 among a great many, but they're sort of representative of the whole. These 3 people are Michael Power, who was a Catholic taxi driver who was murdered in 1987. He was shot in his car while driving his entire family to church.
It was essentially a drive-by shooting with a shotgun.
Yep. And fortunately is not the right word, I suppose, but they were only trying to kill him, and he was the only one who died, although his family was injured. His daughter, I think, had to undergo a horrific-sounding surgery to remove shrapnel from her eye and stuff like that, but the rest of them survived. Then there was the murder of Pat Finucane in 1989. He was a Catholic lawyer, but who was married to a Protestant and had a reputation for being willing to represent anyone, Catholic or Protestant. He was shot in his own home. Gunmen burst into the house and shot him in front of his family. His son is now actually an MP in Northern Ireland, and it seemed like of these 3 cases, his is the one that got looked at the most, I think, because he was possibly the most prominent of the 3.
Yes, I mean, as you say, he was a lawyer who was known for being willing to represent anyone, Catholic or Protestant. And so his death was a particular shock because it wasn't hard to pin him as being sectarian in any particular way.
And then the final murder was that of a man called Lachlan McGinn, who, similar to Mr. Finucane, was killed in his home in 1989. Again, gunmen burst into the house and murdered him while his kids were in bed upstairs. So all 3 of these people were killed by members of the UDA, the Ulster
paramilitary force, as opposed to
yes.
the actual regiment.
And the motive was that supposedly all 3 of these men were IRA members, so these were hits on the enemy. Now, there's no, as far as we can tell, there's no evidence that suggests any of them were actually IRA members. They appear to have just been innocent civilians, as it were, but their murders become central to most of what goes on in all 9 episodes of the podcast.
Well, in part because the claim that they were IRA members as justification for their killings is the kind of question of, well, if they weren't, why were they targeted?
Exactly. So it appears they were targeted by a man called Brian Nelson, who was the head of intelligence for the UDA. And so McGugan talks about how he would gather all this information, which would either be stolen from the army or the police, or in some cases leaked to the UDA because remember the UDA, I mean, it's this weird situation. They're illegal. The army and the police are supposedly out to stop them, but they're also loyalists, which means they're sort of quote-unquote on the same side as the police. So
they're essentially the vigilantes. So they're the Batman of Northern Ireland's Gotham City. Okay, they go around and they do extrajudicial killings.
They do shoot people in the kneecaps a lot, yes.
But they do it for the right kind of cause, and thus we tolerate them. We tolerate their murders. Yeah,
so yeah, I mean, this isn't a universal attitude, but some people within the police and the army want to get rid of these people because they are a bunch of psychos running around killing and abducting and torturing. But some people were sympathetic to them, and so information would get leaked from the army and the police to them. So Nelson would gather up all this information. He'd put together sort of dossiers on people who were targeted, and then hand these off to kill teams, essentially, who would then go and do the murders. And we know some of this because the UDA would publicise this after the fact, because they want people to know that, A, don't mess with us, we will kill our enemies, we are forced to be reckoned with, but B, we're not like, if you're on the IRA side, you're our enemy, but if you're not, we want you to like us. There's a propaganda element to it as well. So they were very sure to actually publicise, hey, look, these people we killed were in the IRA, right? We're not just nutcases whacking innocent civilians. We are, in our own minds at least, waging war on the enemy. And
plus, it allows them to instill fear in IRA members going, well, look, we can track you down and we can get you anywhere. You are not safe.
So this leaking was sort of what raised eyebrows, among other things. But before we get to that, the important fact is that Brian Nelson was, for one thing, just a complete bastard. She goes through the various things he'd done, the various cases of assaults and murders and torturing and what have you over the years. And as well as that, he was an agent, specifically Agent 6137, for the Army's Secretive Force Research Unit, or the FRU.
The FRU, yes.
So he was passing information back to the Army. He was an agent of the Army within the UDA. You know who else was a complete bastard, but also an agent?
Freddie Scappaticci, also known as Scap. And he was the head of the IRA's Nutting Squad, which is a very unfortunate name for a squad, given that nutting is a euphemism for wanking.
Well, these days it is. Back then, your nut was your head, and then it referred to the fact that they shot people in the head a lot. But yes, I mean, it also kind of makes them sound like adorable squirrels, to be honest. But they were not. They were not adorable squirrels. They were nasty, violent pieces of work whose job it was to get rid of what they called touts, which was the word for informants, basically. So anyone who was suspected of informing on the IRA would be abducted, tortured for information, and then probably executed.
And of course, what makes Scappaticci interesting is that because he was an agent of the FRU, the head of the IRA's anti-informant squad was himself someone who should have rooted himself out as being an informant.
He sure was. And I have to say, one of the few, possibly the only bright spot in the whole podcast series was hearing lots of people with thick Belfast accents say the name Scappaticci. You have these, I assume he was of Irish descent or something, but just hearing the name Scappaticci.
Scappaticci.
Anyway, that was, you have to take your pleasures where you can get them in a subject.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking a lot about Scap, because Scap's eventual fate is really quite audacious, at least in some sense.
It sure is. But before we go into the details of Nelson and Scap, the question is, how do we know all of this? And in large part, it is because of the Stevens inquiries, which get a lot of time in the podcast series.
Yeah, and we're saying inquiries here because there's not one, there's not two, but there are three of them.
Yes, so they're called the Stevens inquiries because British detective John Stevens, who nowadays is Lord Stevens, went to Northern Ireland in 1989, in the middle of the Troubles, to lead an investigation into these murders and into the leaking of the information that they'd been involved with. So his initial inquiry, I assume what was originally just called the Stevens Inquiry, was looking into these murders by the UDA, such as the murders of Power, Finucane and Lachlan McGinn. I think there was the murder of Lachlan McGinn was sort of the inciting one that got them out there, but there was this whole series of them that they're looking at. But then when they found out that the FRU was involved, and indeed found out that the FRU existed, the second Stevens inquiry, Stevens 2, looked into them. And then as the investigation went on, there was more information about the Finucane case, because again, as we said, his was the one that was sort of, that he was the most prominent figure, and his was the murder that's been looked into the most. And information coming out about that then resulted in the Stevens 3 inquiry. And I believe all up, it was the longest running inquiry in British sort of policing history.
Yes, well, it hasn't had much in the way of an effect, given that the British government has been reluctant to enact any of the recommendations of Stevens 1, 2 or 3. Now, it's worth pointing out, Josh notes that the Stevens inquiry didn't know about the existence of the FRU.
Despite having dealt with the army?
Yes, because the FRU was very secretive. And the only time they became kind of aware the FRU existed was when the officers they were using for the inquiry burnt down suspiciously.
Very suspiciously.
Burnt down. And so the Stevens inquiry was about to move on Nelson, so they felt they had kind of enough information to go, look, Nelson is our man.
On the UDA in general, I think.
Yeah, but Nelson in particular is being the kind of target one. And then their officers just burn down. And that's when they start to get whispers of, yeah, that was probably the FRU that did that.
Yeah, so the day before, Stevens is flying back to Belfast the night before all of this is going to go down and gets there to find out his office is burned down. And then there was the whole thing with the reporters, wasn't there? He's flying into Belfast to undertake this secret operation and notices on the plane there are a couple of reporters going to Belfast on the same flight as him to report on the operation, the supposedly secret operation that he's about to carry out.
So there had been a leak of information which indicated that either they were being tapped or people within the inquiry were passing information along to people like Brian Nelson.
Yeah, so the official explanation was, and I believe still remains, that it was an accidental fire, but some people at the time said, oh, this seems like the sort of thing the Frew might have done, and the Stevens and his team were basically like, sorry, the who? What is the Frew? And this is kind of how they found out about them. And it certainly seemed, whoever was responsible for this fire, assuming it wasn't an accident, seems to have been trying to destroy their case against Nelson and the other UDA members. Fortunately, yes.
But Stevens was a very canny investigator. So not only did they have copies in their offices in Belfast, they were sending copies of all their evidence back to the UK on a daily basis. So they would have duplicates both in Northern Ireland and also, I think, back in London. So Stevens, even though he wasn't aware that the building was going to burn down, was at least aware that you needed to have backups of all your files. So burning down their offices was a setback in a certain sense, but it didn't destroy the evidence.
No, and it certainly wasn't enough to put them off their operations. So, fire or no fire, the next morning Stevens and his crew went around and arrested a whole bunch of UDA members that they had been gathering this evidence on. And at first they had trouble finding Brian Nelson, and apparently they had to go to the army and say, look, do you know where this Brian Nelson is? And ended up threatening to have people arrested for obstruction before Nelson finally showed up, and they were able to arrest him. And once they arrested him, my goodness, he basically fessed up to everything and then spent, do you remember how long they said he spent? He spent days upon days writing down,
I can't remember how many days it was, but I mean, it had to be several days because he writes 170-page long
170
documents
pages
as to what he did, detailing on a day-by-day, if not sometimes hour-by-hour basis, things that he had been doing. And this gets known as Nelson's diary. It's meant to be private, so it's meant to only be accessible to members of the inquiry, but eventually it does get leaked and people are spreading it around. Although, once again, we're talking back here in the 90s or so it was commonly accessible and known 30 years ago. When it comes to Cara McGugan trying to get a copy of the diary, it turns out actually it's very, very hard to get hold of now.
Yes, but she does eventually get it. I think to begin with, she gets
pages of it,
and eventually gets
the entire document.
And so this diary gives the full story of Brian Nelson, his operations within the UDA, and his operations as a spy or a double agent for the army.
Although it is written in a style which indicates that he's kind of blameless.
Yes, he basically denies any responsibility for anything.
He was just obeying orders, Josh. He was just obeying orders.
As far as he's concerned, he told the army all about whatever the UDA was going to get up to, and if they didn't stop it,
then that's their fault.
Yeah.
Even if he was giving orders directly to have people killed, the army knew that was going to happen. They didn't intervene.
Yeah, so he makes a point of distancing himself from the gunmen who did the killings, gunmen who supposedly did the killings sort of, if not on his orders, then using his information, having been pointed towards their targets by him. And specifically in the case of Michael Power, he claims that he didn't know who Michael Power was at the time and did not order his killing. And Cara McGugan points out that this is all his words, and it's entirely self-serving, and she does not find that convincing at all. She figures he must have known because he was the guy who was sending people out. But yeah, the interesting bit is his version of how this all came about. So he says he was in the army, in the Irish army, until the late 1960s, 69, I think. He then left the army, but then joined the UDA. But then he was in the UDA, he went to prison after an incident where he abducted and tortured someone who they suspected of being in the IRA or something, and would have killed him had the army not shown up and stopped them, and he went to prison. Then after he'd been in prison in 1984, he then went off to the army and offered them his services, in his words, to help stop the killings. And he says that the army then told him, okay, go back to the UDA, rejoin the UDA and act as our spy within them. Now, one thing that people sort of weren't sure about there is that, again, after the diary leaked and a bunch of people got to look at it, a bunch of people who were familiar with the circumstances of some of these things he was talking about, they pointed out that abduction and torture case that he got sent to prison for, he did actually seem to get off surprisingly lightly in terms of concerning what happened to him.
What happened to him compared to other people who had done similar, it turned out he got a very light sentence indeed, which is why people ended up thinking maybe he'd been an army asset the entire time.
Yes, if he claims he started in 1984, and yet there he is in this case in 1973, where he's seemingly getting special treatment. So sort of McGugan said that people have offered other theories and notes that there's no actual evidence for this, but some people believe that he never left the army at all, that his discharge in 1969 was just faked.
A cover story is because he was going to become a spy for the army working within the UDA.
Yeah, other people suggest, well, maybe that bit of it's true, but then when he got picked up in 1973, maybe that's when he became an agent, and suggested that
he was
maybe
offered a sweetheart deal. So essentially,
Yeah.
Look, you could have a pretty harsh prison sentence here, but we know you're a good man, essentially. I mean, you used to work for the army. Only the most honourable, best people in the world are trained killers. So, therefore, why don't you come and work for us instead?
Yeah. So, but again, we don't know for sure. We have his word, and his word is not entirely reliable, but that's all we have. So, having confessed to a whole bunch of stuff, Nelson went on trial. He pleaded guilty to 20 charges, including 5 charges of conspiracy to commit murder. And again, this was not like I'm pretty sure the Stevens inquiry reckoned they could link him to over 100 murders or assaults or torturings, but these were sort of representative. In particular, though, he was not charged with the murders of Michael Power, Pat Finucane, or Lachlan McGinn. They were not among the representative charges of them. In the trial, Colonel Gordon Kerr, was the head of the FRU, he gave testimony as a secret witness to argue for leniency. He basically argued that he admitted that some of Nelson's handlers did think he went a bit too far sometimes, but said that they didn't. The part of their problems, and one of the reasons for the way things happened with them is that they didn't actually have any regulations. Like it's a bit weird. They basically point out that according to the law at the time, it was illegal for them to have agents, to have informants at all. Just simply dealing with people who were in the UDA was against the law. But they needed to do that, so there wasn't. There was no way they could do that. That was entirely kosher. So he sort of argued, what else could we do? In particular, he argued that Nelson's the whole thing that they used to justify all of this, at the end of the day, the information we received from him saved lives. Brian Nelson allowed us to save lives, and that's why you should go easy on him.
I mean, he may have killed some people. He may have led to the murders of a lot of people who weren't in the IRA. But there's an undisclosed number of lives that were saved due to the information that Brian Nelson provided us, and thus that justifies everything that we did.
Yeah, and the judge gave weight to the fact that he had supposedly saved a bunch of lives, even though he had also done a bunch of horrible things. And so his over 100 years' worth of sentences would be served concurrently, which meant he only served 10 years in prison. And he eventually got out and died in 2003. So it certainly, from all you hear about Brian Nelson, it certainly sounds like he was basically given free rein. There didn't seem to be any attempt for them to say, hey, maybe don't do some of the stuff you're doing, even though you're telling us about it. Some people suggested it was more like he ran his handlers in the army rather than his handlers running him. And on top of that, he may have been actually given extra information by the army so that he could target these IRA members better. And all of this then starts to sound quite familiar when you look at the way things worked out for Freddie Scappaticci. Tell me about
so
Scap.
we're now moving away from the Ulster Defence Association to the Irish Republican Army, where it turns out the Frew was also running an agent at that particular time. So here we're looking at Scappaticci, and like Nelson, seemed to have been given free rein to do whatever he wanted and be protected by the state, that's the British state, as much as possible after what had happened became uncovered. And the weird thing about this is that Scappaticci isn't even on the Stevens inquiry radar until Scappaticci's identity is outed by a journalist. So back in August of 1999, the Sunday Times in Ireland published a story about how the IRA had been compromised by the Frew and had an agent whose code name was Steak Knife in their upper leadership. Now, Steak Knife is a interesting name for a agent of any particular kind.
And it's worth noting that the stake is S-T-A-K-E, so it's not even actually the name of an implementing stake. It's just a straight
knife.
Word. So again, remember, this is 1999, so it's after the Good Friday Agreement, so now the Troubles are sort of officially
10 years afterwards. So Scappaticci has been basically living in Belfast.
10 years after the Stevens inquiry started, but 98 was the Good Friday Agreement, so it's not too long after that. But so now that all the stuff's over, suddenly stuff like this starts coming out.
And people start asking who is Steak Knife. And of course, the big question has been asked by IRA members, which is, God, so there was an informant in our leadership working for the British. Which one of us was it? So it actually causes quite a lot of ructions within the IRA, which of course is at this stage reorganizing itself as a political party, since it's going to be involved in democratic elections in the Northern Irish Parliament. And so the IRA are going, who is Steak Knife? We want to know who Steak Knife is. And so in 2003, Scappaticci's identity as Steak Knife is outed by an army whistleblower. And this is where things get a little bit crazy. So Scappaticci immediately leaves Belfast, going, well, it's not safe for me to be here with all this baseless speculation about my being Steak Knife, so I'm just going to go away for a while to let things cool down. Now, MI5 had offered to relocate him and basically give him a new identity in the United Kingdom. But Scappaticci decides that he's going to actually brazen it out. He returns to Belfast and denies everything. And so he goes around telling everybody he wasn't an agent. In part, the podcast suggests because if he admitted to being an agent, there are still paramilitary aspects of the IRA post the end of the Troubles who'd be quite happy to put a knife in Steak Knife's back. So, of course, he has to maintain he wasn't the agent. He actually was in order to preserve his life.
And it's also, I think, there's also the fact that the IRA was kind of happy for him to not be Steak Knife because it would make them look bad. It was this guy high up enough in the IRA was actually an agent. What anyone could have been.
Cara McGugan ends up interviewing a senior member of Sinn Féin, and they say, look, we actually had, once the information came out, pretty good reason to think that Scappaticci was Steak Knife. But we weren't going to tell anyone that because there were elements of the IRA who were so sympathetic to Scappaticci that they would think that we were the informants trying to make a good man look dishonorable, because they were never going to believe that he was a dishonorable man in the first place. So there was a really interesting political game going on here as to what people could say as opposed to what they wanted to say. Anyway, we're going all the way back to 2003. He returns to Belfast and he says, look, I'm not an agent and I'm going to ask the British government to confirm that fact.
Yes.
I want a judicial review proving absolutely that I am not Steakknife.
Yes, I have to say, listening to some of this stuff, you do kind of think the balls on this guy.
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
dude who knows he is, who was an agent for the army, as we've just said, there were a bunch of circumstances which meant people were willing to believe that he wasn't one. And so he goes to the government and says, he tries to force the British government to publicly say Freddie Scappaticci was not an agent, when both he knows that and they know that that's a lie. He tries to get the government to lie publicly.
Yeah. So he would have to lie under oath, and then the
That's not going to bother him at all.
Yeah, and then the government would be forced to make a false statement. So basically, either they would lie under oath, or if they went before a judge, they have to go, yes, Scappaticci was Steakknife. Sorry, I didn't quite hear that. Could you say that louder for the stenographer? Yes, Scappaticci was... Louder, please. Scappaticci was Steakknife. So yes. The British government was kind of in a bind.
Well, yes. So, I mean, their official policy at the time, they had this whole neither confirm nor deny, NCND, was their official policy. So, because obviously, people said, so was Scappaticci Steakknife? And they're like, well, we can neither confirm nor deny. This is a security matter sort of thing. And so Scappaticci brings this case to force them to break their policy and make a statement either way. And yeah, as you say, their choices are lie under oath or admit that they were working with the British government, was working with a high-ranking member of the IRA. So this wasn't a great situation, and the ideal situation for the government would be if the judge ruled, no, you don't have to break your neither confirm nor deny policy. You don't have to say whether or not he officially is. And they figured it would be more likely for the judge to rule that way if he knew that Scap was lying, right? Because if the judge believed that Scap wasn't an agent, then he might be more motivated to say, yes, you should clear this man's name, government. You should make an announcement. But if the judge believed that Scap was secretly an agent, then you think, oh, okay, the government, if I force the government to say something, I'm going to be forcing them to make an embarrassing admission. So maybe I should say, yes, stick with the NCND. So to make sure that things went that way, they went and told the judge. The British government, or whoever it was, went to the judge and said, yep, when Scap says he wasn't an agent, he's lying. He was an agent for us. So just take that under consideration when you make your ruling. And they told Scap that they were going to do this. And he was like, yep, that sounds like a good idea. And so sure enough, the ruling went that no, the government does not have to break the NCND policy. They don't have to say whether or not Scap was an agent. So the government got what they wanted. But this also worked out for Scap, because he's like, yeah, see, they wouldn't, they didn't say I'm an agent. There's nobody's got any proof that I was an agent. So there you go.
Yeah, so he ends up not being charged with anything whatsoever.
Yeah, the Stevens inquiry, she talks to various members of the inquiry team, and you can see how frustrated they were that they would keep building these cases against him and other people, and it would go off to the prosecutorial service, and they would just come back and say, no, we don't think there's a case for prosecution.
Yeah.
Not necessarily because, not necessarily them saying, no, your evidence isn't good enough, but just, no, the whole security aspect of it all means we think, no, it's not in the country's interest to prosecute this guy.
And yet, eventually, he decides to take up MI5 with the witness protection angle. So he moves to the UK, he changes his name, and dies in 2023 in witness protection, much to the surprise of his neighbours when he dies, and it gets outed that, Steakknife just died. You were neighbours with Steakknife. What was he like?
So yes, in 2024, because as we'll see in a little while, there are investigations ongoing to this day around this sort of stuff. The Stevens inquiries, I think, finished up and issued their final reports, but operations are still going. In particular, one called Operation Canova, which was an investigation that kind of came out of the Stevens inquiry. I think again it might have been one of the ones that was looking at the Finucane. Oh no, it wasn't. If it was talking about Steak. Anyway, there were a whole bunch of them. Was the thing. But in 2024, Operation Canova issued a sort of a provisional report. It wasn't their final report, which concluded that Steak Knife definitely cost more lives than he saved. But even in 2024, even after Freddie Scappaticci was dead, they still weren't allowed to officially say on the record that Steak Knife was Freddie Scappaticci. So they say, Steak Knife was this agent, Steak Knife was a psycho who killed a whole bunch of people, and the information he got definitely didn't balance out the lives, the deaths that he was responsible for, but MI5 had refused to allow them to say,
but who
and
was
by the way,
Knife?
Steak Knife was Freddie Scappaticci.
Who knows who Steak Knife is? I mean, there's a lot of speculation in Ireland that Steak Knife was a particular person named by the media, but MI5 are saying we can't say their name. So really, who was Steak Knife?
Maybe Steak Knife was the friends we made along the way.
Maybe there's a steak knife in all of us.
Well, there's a thought. But so I mean, the podcast spends a lot of time talking about Brian Nelson and Freddie Scappaticci because we basically know the most about them. Nelson had his diary, and Scappaticci had been investigated a lot. But there were, from the sounds of things, there were a hell of a lot of others.
It wasn't just there were two bad eggs, one on either side of the aisle. It seems that the Frew were running a lot of bad eggs. They were a bad egg hatchery.
Yeah, so later on the podcast goes over various other cases where would basically be a person was involved in a particularly nasty crime, murderers or what have you, and then kind of got away with it suspiciously lightly. And there are all cases where we don't have any proof, but simply the fact that these people got away with stuff that you would expect them to have gone to prison for a long time for led people to suggest maybe they were also agents and were therefore protected by the army. We were kept out of prison so the army could continue using them as an asset. The army or the police or MI5.
Yeah, I mean, and Stephen points out, of the 210 loyalists they arrested over the Sevens 1, 2, and 3, only 3 of them weren't being run as agents by some other agency.
So yeah, some people, it seemed as though that there were so many people who were actually agents for the army or the police. It was almost like the army or the police was actually just running terrorism. And so, the majority of some of these organizations seem to be actually being run by the army.
Yeah, or if not the majority of the organization, the majority of the upper echelons of the organizations were agents for the British government, or at least working with the British government.
Yes, which brings us to the question of collusion. The parts of these investigations were also, was the army or the police actually colluding with loyalist paramilitaries to her? So not just turning a blind eye or making sure the system goes easier on them when they get caught for stuff, but actually helping them to do the things that they did. So indeed, as we said before, Brian Nelson always claimed that it was soldiers in the Ulster Defence Regiment who pointed out Michael Power was an IRA member. He reckoned that the reason why Michael Power was targeted was because the army had said, hey, this is a guy you should look into. And similarly with Pat Finucane, people had claimed that the police had encouraged the UDA to target them. And then there was a whole thing, I didn't actually note this bit down, but there was an episode, wasn't there, where the police or someone had been accusing him of being in the IRA, and then someone actually brought it up in Parliament that people like this guy, Pat Finucane, are working for the IRA. Like the government essentially painted a target on his back.
Yeah.
And so Nelson claimed that after Michael Power was killed, and then it turned out, no, this guy wasn't in the IRA, he reckoned his bosses, the people he worked for, were outraged. They were like, we, like I said before, they did not want to be in the business of killing innocent civilians because it made them look bad. Yeah. And they, had a propaganda war to win as well as
murder. They were just against the idea of murdering the wrong people.
Yeah, because their whole thing is, they think they want what they think is best for Ireland, and that it's hard to maintain that claim if you're murdering innocent Irish people. There's an extra little bit especially with the case of Michael Power, where there's the claim that the police had actually approached him to become an informant, and he had said, "No, I don't want to be one." And there was another case. They mention a guy called Joe Fenton, who was one of the victims of the Nutting Squad. He had been picked up by the IRA and murdered by them. And there was apparently Michael Power had known Joe Fenton, and the police perhaps thought he knew something about Fenton's murder, and so were trying to bring him in as an informant to sort of keep him quiet about that. But then when he said no, then that's when they had him killed. One thing that was mentioned right at the start was the fact that every day they drove through an army roadblock, or every week they drove through an army roadblock at the end of their street on the way to church, and yet on the day that he was killed, the roadblock was not there anymore.
Just disappeared. Yeah,
just disappeared. And indeed, just the icing on the cake was that supposedly the detective who had tried to recruit Michael Power as an IRA ended up being in charge of his murder afterwards, and the investigation, surprise, went nowhere.
Sorry, I'm probably going to say in charge of his murder. I guess no, murder investigation. But yes,
although I mean, you could make a case for that as well.
Well, yeah, and that's the worrying thing, because what we do know is suggestive of so much more.
Yeah, and so then at the end of the day, the question they keep asking is, like, why? There's the question all the way through of, was the state, were people literally getting away with murder? And it certainly looks like in some cases they were. And so then the case is, what's the point? Is they're supposedly getting all this information, and yet they're not using it to stop a hell of a lot. Why do this in the first place?
Well, I mean, the uncharitable view is that they were leaking information to get rid of the people they didn't like.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for example, you have, if you're passing information on to the UDA, then of course you're eradicating IRA members and people who might be sympathetic to the IRA. I mean, they're going to be people who are kind of on the cusp, so we should get rid of them as well, just in case. And of course, if you're running the person who heads the Nutting Squad, then of course you can also get rid of some of those awkward IRA members who might suddenly be becoming aware there's something weird going on there. So the uncharitable take is, you run these agents so you can basically control what's going on.
Yes, there does seem to be, but of course the official, once again, the official justification for all of this is that the intelligence supplied by these agents saved lives. That's what they'll always say. There are various, one thing we didn't talk about was at one point it mentions there was a book written under a pseudonym by a member of the FRU who called Unsung Hero, in which he talks about how he went along with UDA people as they were shooting innocent people and so on. This was the sort of heroics he was involved in. But again, he's always claimed, he basically says he sleeps easy at night because his actions saved lives. But other reports into it, at least in the case of people who we know were full-on psychos like Nelson and Scappaticci, came to the conclusion that they definitely killed more people than they saved. So that, like as we said, back in Brian Nelson's trial, Colonel Kerr came along and said Nelson saved lives. The Ministry of Defence apparently officially said that his information had saved 217 lives. And they don't give any justification. That my assumption is that he gave them 217 pieces of information, and they were counting everything he told them as a life saved or something like that. But like a later inquiry reckoned they could name 3 individuals whose life is one of them. No, it wasn't him. It was one of the lives that Brian Nelson saved, or Brian Nelson's information saved, was Jerry Adams. One of the head guys in the IRA, because basically they actually, I said before, why didn't they say maybe don't do that? But yeah, the one case we do know of where Brian Nelson leaked information, hey, we're planning to do a hit on Jerry Adams, and the Army's like, no, don't do a bloody hit on Jerry Adams. That's gonna, killing one of the top guys like that is really gonna throw the cat among the pigeons. That'll destabilize everything. So no, don't do that. So yes, that was the one case we know of where a life was saved, and it was one of the heads of the IRA. But again, and as I said just before, the Canova report said that Scappaticci had definitely killed more people than he saved. And then as well, on top of that, in terms of your value proposition of the whole thing, is that the fact that these agents were protected, it often worked in favour of their associates even when they weren't agents, because there were cases where they talk about one case where Brian Nelson was involved in an abduction and a torturing sort of situation, and the army basically cooked up an alibi to get him out of it. But these dodgy goings on ended up weakening the cases of the other people who were involved in this, and they ended up getting their cases thrown out. So in the end, they protected Nelson, but he ended up seeing a whole bunch of people get off from the same crime. And the one that I thought was very interesting is at one point Cara McGugan gets an interview with Johnny Mad Dog Adair, who was one of the leaders of the UDA, who worked with Brian Nelson. And in his words, he says that if he had known Nelson was an agent at the time, he would have, quote, wrapped him in cotton wool. He would have done everything he could to protect the guy because Nelson's immunity rubbed off on them. He reckoned that Johnny Adair reckoned he never got arrested for anything he did with Nelson when he had been charged and arrested for other things. And similar things happened with other UDA members. So, in terms of the good that was done versus the bad that was allowed to happen, it does seem hard to make a case that the good outweighs the bad.
Yeah, and this is a case of infiltration and conversion, which is a conspiracy, if not by the British state, by elements of the British state in the form of a secretive part of the British Army operating in Northern Ireland. And as the podcast kind of ends, there really haven't been any consequences.
No. So the podcast doesn't really end on a definitive note, because the fact is there are still inquiries going on. There are various
the Stevens inquiries, the government has never enacted most of the recommendations.
No. And there are various sort of court cases going on for people who just trying to get information out of the government. There's a whole bunch of ongoing stuff. So, as we say, the Michael Powers family, Michael Powers' murder has never been solved, essentially. No one's ever been charged with his murder. And there are all various cases being brought by families of people who were killed who basically just want the truth, is all. They're pretty sure they know who killed maybe not the specific individuals, but know basically what happened, but just want to know the facts, the actual facts behind it all. And still in the year of our Lord 2025, 27 years after the Good Friday Agreement, the stuff is still going on.
Yeah, it's all kind of sad.
Yeah.
And which is kind of the point of all three series of Bed of Lies. The first one is the police were infiltrating activist groups, getting up to no good, and virtually no consequence to those police officers. The second one is, they were giving people infected blood in the UK, and they knew about it, but once again, no actual real consequences to it. And the third series is, you won't believe what the British government was up to during the Troubles, and you also won't believe the fact there are no consequences.
Yes. So there you go. So, we've been talking about this for about an hour, and the series itself is about 10 hours long. So we've only sort of touched a tenth of it. So
and I would recommend, if you want to listen to that series, it's very captivating.
It is. Although, as Em said at the start, I wrote a ridiculous amount of notes while listening through this. I didn't do that to begin with, but after I listened to the first couple of episodes, it does kind of jump around a lot. It introduces people, sometimes only in passing, and then a little while later it becomes significant who they were and what their deal was. So I eventually realised I just kind of had to write down every single thing that happened in each episode so that I could then, when they came up again, I'd be able to go back and refer to it. So I think I wrote
16 pages of notes.
16 pages of notes,
yep,
which we condensed down into 1 hour. So I think that's not bad going. But definitely, if you want all the detail, and again, like I say, we left out a bunch of side stories, a bunch of extra things. So if you're interested, I definitely recommend listening to Bed of Lies Series 3 by Cara McGugan.
This is not a paid endorsement.
This is not a paid endorsement. We just think it was good.
Yeah.
And obviously incredibly conspiratorial. So it's good fodder for us.
Yeah, and it is a very nice example of the fact that states get up to things that a lot of people just don't realize. So one of my recurrent issues with a lot of generous philosophers It's like, oh, yeah, no, there were lots of conspiracies and things going on in the early 20th century and the mid 20th century, but, hasn't been that much bad stuff going on since then. And then you go, yeah, what about this example? Oh, well, that's a one off. Oh, what about this example? Oh, that's also a one off. You just keep presenting them with more one offs. And this is another example of, no, these things are going on all the time.
Yep. So there you go. So that's the end of this episode, but of course there is a bonus episode for our beloved patrons to record.
And
so
I have no idea what's in it.
No, because we're doing the return of What the Conspiracy, but just a mini one, just a short little aperitif of a What the Conspiracy. I'll be presenting him with a story that hopefully they have not heard before, but you never know. If that turns out to not be the case, then we can just discuss it.
Is it the curious case of the dog who barked in the night?
No, I can guarantee you it is not that. So if you want to hear exactly what it is I'm going to tell Em about and find out whether or not it's something they've heard of before, you'll need to be one of our patrons. And if you are not currently one of our patrons, you can go to patreon.com and go search for the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy and sign yourself up. And you too will count yourself among the ranks.
Sorry, U2 is going to count itself among. So Bono
if
and
they sign up, hey, I won't turn anyone away. You two can sign up as well.
I mean, they are Irish. This is probably an episode that they would have been interested in.
Yeah, but any individual who signs themselves up as a patron.
I mean, even members of REM could sign up for this podcast if they really wanted to.
There's nothing to stop them. And they will then become the greatest and the shiniest and the sweetest smelling of all human beings. It's a scientific fact.
I mean, there are some rock stars, if they sign up, they're actually not going to become sweet or shiny creatures. There are limits to our power.
But we do what we can. So, I think until next time, are your travels going to put a kink in our recording schedule? I suspect we may have to organise around exactly when and where you are.
Yeah, so we may need to change the recording day, in part because I'm not quite sure what my schedule in Otago is going to look like. Although evenings, I think, are probably going to be fine. Now, of course, when I'm back home in Aotearoa, New Zealand, my expectation is that Josh comes to me to record, which means that Josh will need to fly down to Dunedin on a fortnightly basis for recording of the podcast. And that may change the timetabling ever so slightly.
Yeah, we'll see how that works out. But until our next episode...
I mean, I guess you could drive, but I wouldn't be super reliant on the ferries at the moment.
No. We'll see what we can work out. So...
Yes.
Until our next episode, whenever that turns out to be, I'm just going to say, conspiracy. See you later.
Oh, see, I was okay. Should I do something in my bad Belfast accent? And the answer is no. No,
I can't. I have trouble with the Belfast accent. I have to say, the only Belfast accent I ever really encountered was my parents listening to Van Morrison albums. So all I can ever talk about is the moonlight on your face, but.
See, I'm just thinking of Corky and the Juice Pigs with with their Van Morrison reference, which is pretty good.
Look that up as well once you've listened to Bed of Lies.
So I'll just sign off by saying I'm the only gay Eskimo, the only one I know.
Truth. The Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy features Josh Addison and Associate Professor M.R.X. Dentith. Our producers are a mysterious cabal of conspirators known as Tom, Philip, and another who is so mysterious that they remain anonymous. You can contact us electronically via podcastconspiracy@gmail.com or join our Patreon and get access to our Discord server. Or don't, I'm not your mum. And remember, according to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, a stranger is just a friend you haven't met.